Okay? So you want to own a fast food restaurant. Buy into a proven brand. Follow a playbook that's already been perfected across thousands of locations. And let decades of national advertising and instant customer recognition do the marketing for you. You're not gambling on an unproven idea. You're buying a franchise system that's already figured out the food, the pricing, and the operations. That is the dream, and it is not entirely wrong. Here's what it doesn't tell you. The very same debt-fueled growth model that let the biggest, most successful operators in this business build empires of over 1,000 restaurants is the exact same model that can bankrupt that empire in a single bad year, even while the food, the brand, and the customers never went anywhere. Let's start with what it costs to buy in. A single traditional McDonald's franchise now requires a total initial investment of $1.47 to $2.73 million, on top of a $45,000 franchise fee, and the company requires at least $500,000 in liquid, unborrowed capital before you're even considered, with 40% of total startup costs required in cash rather than financing. Burger King and Wendy's carry similarly steep entry points, with franchise fees around $50,000 before construction begins, while Subway sits at the cheaper end of the industry at $116,000 to $263,000 total. Once open, McDonald's charges an ongoing 4% monthly service fee on gross sales, plus rent that averages 10.7% of sales, meaning a meaningful chunk of every dollar a franchisee earns flows straight back to corporate before it ever reaches the owner's pocket. And at a typical $1.8 million investment, franchisees can expect roughly 8.5 years just to recover their initial capital. Before you sell a single burger, there's a category of cost baked into the franchise model itself that most first-time owners underestimate. You don't actually get to run the business your way. Menu pricing, store design, supplier relationships, and operating procedures are dictated from corporate, which is exactly the trade-off you're making for brand recognition and a proven playbook. But it also means you have essentially no ability to cut costs or reposition the business if your local market shifts, the way an independent restaurant owner could. And real estate is rarely fully yours either. McDonald's, for example, owns 45% of the land and 70% of the buildings under its own franchised restaurants, collecting rent from the very franchisees who are supposed to be independent business owners. Here's the trap sitting underneath the entire industry, and it's the one that has repeatedly taken down operators far larger than any single restaurant owner. Because individual franchise units are relatively affordable to finance one at a time, an entire class of large, multi-unit operators has emerged, buying up hundreds or even thousands of locations under a single corporate parent, financed almost entirely with debt. This model works beautifully as long as sales keep growing and interest rates stay manageable, because economies of scale genuinely do lower costs per unit. But it means the entire operator's survival depends on servicing enormous, centralized debt across a portfolio of individually thin-margin restaurants. And if sales soften across the whole system at once, there's no single strong location to absorb the shortfall, because the debt sits at the corporate level, not spread evenly beneath each restaurant's own cash flow. Once a location is up and running, the revenue model is straightforward, which is precisely why the format scales so well. Average unit volume across the fast food industry sits around $1 million a year, though top performers like Chick-fil-A and McDonald's run considerably higher, McDonald's averaging $2.6 million per restaurant annually. Margins come from a combination of high-volume, low-price transactions, tight portion control, standardized ingredient costs negotiated at massive scale by the parent company, and labor scheduled with surgical precision against predictable hourly demand curves. Drive-through and delivery have become an increasingly important second revenue layer, often generating a majority of a location's total sales and requiring far less real estate and staffing per dollar of revenue than dine-in seating, which is exactly why many chains have spent the last decade shrinking dining rooms in favor of more drive-through lanes. Now, the disaster case study, and it's a lesson in exactly how debt-fueled scale can turn a thriving franchise system into a bankruptcy filing overnight. NPC International, founded in 1962, grew over decades into the largest Pizza Hut franchisee in the United States, eventually operating more than 1,225 Pizza Hut locations, roughly 1 out of every 6 Pizza Huts in the entire country, along with nearly 400 Wendy's restaurants across 27 states, employing close to 40,000 people. In 2018, the company was sold to a group of investors in a billion-dollar deal that loaded the business with debt, and by early 2020, NPC was carrying close to $1 billion in obligations. The underlying restaurants weren't failing in any dramatic way. Pizza Hut itself was actually one of the few chains posting same-store sales growth in the months leading up to the filing, boosted by digital and delivery orders. But NPC had been squeezed for years by rising labor costs as competition for workers drove up wages across nearly half its Pizza Hut locations and nearly a third of its Wendy's units, by discount-heavy pricing strategies from Pizza Hut corporate that pressured margins across the entire system, and by the sheer weight of servicing debt on over 1,600 individual restaurants simultaneously. In January 2020, the company missed an interest payment, triggering credit downgrades from both major ratings agencies. Then the pandemic hit, and even though Pizza Hut's delivery-heavy model actually held up better than most sit-down concepts, it wasn't enough. NPC filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in July 2020 with $903 million in debt, pre-negotiating a restructuring with the majority of its lenders and ultimately selling off large portions of its restaurant portfolio. Individual Pizza Hut restaurants kept their doors open and kept serving customers throughout the entire process because the franchise brand, the food, and the local demand were never actually the problem. The company failed because 1,000 profitable enough restaurants, each running on thin individual margins, had been stacked underneath a single mountain of centralized acquisition debt that none of them, even collectively, could service once growth slowed and costs rose at the same time. Let's run the numbers on 2 scenarios. Optimistic case. You buy a single, well-located franchise for $1.8 million, financed conservatively with your required 40% cash down payment, and no additional acquisition debt beyond the original purchase. The restaurant generates $1.2 million in annual revenue against food costs, labor, royalties, and rent, totaling roughly $1 million, leaving a genuine $200,000 annual margin, a real if modest return that recovers your initial investment within roughly 9 years and provides durable income for decades after. Realistic case. You follow the multi-unit operator playbook, acquiring 10 locations rapidly using significant leveraged debt to capture economies of scale. Exactly NPC's model at a smaller scale. Individual restaurants perform reasonably well, generating steady if unspectacular per-unit margins. But rising minimum wages, Delivery competition and corporate-mandated discount pricing squeeze margins across the entire portfolio simultaneously. And because your debt service is centralized, rather than distributed evenly beneath each location's own cash flow, even a modest system-wide sales dip of just a few percentage points can leave you unable to service acquisition debt across the whole group, turning 10 individually functional restaurants into a single, consolidated bankruptcy filing. So if you decide to own a fast food restaurant, understand what you're actually buying. You're not buying an independent business with full control over your own economics. You're buying a standardized unit inside someone else's system, one whose margins, pricing, and operating rules are set from corporate headquarters. Owned carefully, with conservative financing and a single well-run location, that trade-off can produce a genuinely durable, if modest, small business. When you expand aggressively with debt, opening hundreds of locations like the biggest restaurant chains, you're no longer just operating restaurants. You're betting that sales will stay strong and labor costs won't suddenly spike at the same time. As the industry's biggest bankruptcy in recent years showed, that gamble can unravel much faster than most people expect.